It is still dark outside when an old wooden house in Yasnaya Polyana stirs with restless footsteps. The date is October 28, 1910. The world does not yet know it, but within hours the disappearance of one old man will become headline news from New York to Tokyo. For now, though, everything begins with a single sound. The hurried shuffle of worn boots across wet autumn soil. An elderly woman, exhausted, trembling, wrapped in a shawl, moves toward the estate's pond. She stumbles through the cold mud, breathing sharply, almost choking on the icy air. Her name is Sofia Andreevna Tolstoya, and she is the wife of the most famous writer on the planet. Moments earlier she was told the words that finally broke her. "Has gone. Lev left the house." After decades of marriage, decades of genius, scandal, arguments, love, brilliance, and pain, her husband has vanished into the night. She slips on a wooden footbridge. The planks, soaked with rain, give no support. Sophia loses balance and falls backwards into the dark water. A splash echoes across the quiet estate. Servants and family members sprint toward her, grabbing at her arms, pulling her back to shore. For a few seconds, the night is chaos, shouting, splashing, lantern light bouncing wildly on the surface of the pond. And then silence returns. The old woman is safe. But nothing else will be safe ever again. Just a few minutes before this, her daughter had delivered the news. Tolstoy, 82 years old, the man who wrote War and Peace and Anna Karenina, the man whose letters could shake governments and whose ideas inspired revolutions, had finally walked out. No cloak, no escort, barely any luggage. He simply left his home, left his marriage, left the life he built. And the world had no idea where he was going. Within days, the story would explode. Reuters would issue urgent bulletins. Newspapers in America, France, Egypt, China, and Australia would print the same dramatic headline on their front pages. Tolstoy has disappeared. Rumors swirl at lightning speed. Some insist he has gone to become a monk. Others say he is dying in the woods. The French Parliament even prepares to honor him, only to learn they might have been misinformed. A mixture of panic and awe spreads across continents. After all, this isn't just the disappearance of a writer. This is the disappearance of a moral figure, a cultural force, a man who shaped entire nations. And so begins the final chapter of his life, not with a majestic speech or a peaceful moment by a fireplace, but with a storm of raw human emotion. An elderly woman crying in the mud. Family members running in fear. A silent estate, suddenly emptied of its greatest voice. And somewhere out there, in the darkness of rural Russia, a frail old man making the last, desperate attempt to escape the life that had become too heavy even for him. This is the story of Leo Tolstoy, told not from the comfortable distance of textbooks, but from the beating heart of the man himself. A story of brilliance and doubt, glory and despair, and the final journey that captured the imagination of the entire world. Long before the world called him a genius, Leo Tolstoy was simply a small boy wandering the endless avenues of an aristocratic estate. Yasnaya Polyana in the 1820s was not just a home, it was a universe of its own. Tall birch trees circled the manor like silent guardians, servants moved quietly through long echoing corridors, and every room breathed the weight of old Russian nobility. Leo was born into a family that seemed carved directly out of history books. Generals, diplomats, poets, and princes filled his family tree like characters from an epic saga. Stories of Catherine the Great's court, of the Napoleonic Wars, of duels and romances, and grand political intrigues. These weren't legends for him. They were dinner table memories. And yet, behind all this grandeur lay something darker, something that would stay with him for the rest of his life: loss. His mother died before he was too early for him to remember her face, but just early enough to leave him with a lifelong ache, a sensation of something missing. Tolstoy would later write about her almost like one writes about an angel. Distant, perfect, unreachable. Her absence shaped him even more than her presence ever could have. His father tried to keep the household together, strict, noble, with a quiet love he never quite put into words. But death seemed to follow the family like an unwanted shadow. When Leo turned 8, his father suffered a sudden stroke and died as well. For the second time, the children became orphans. And for the second time, their world collapsed. From that moment, Leo and his siblings were passed from one relative to another like a precious but burdensome legacy. One aunt took them in, showering them with warmth and culture until she, too, passed away just a few years later. Another aunt arrived, moved them to Kazan, and tried to rebuild something resembling a normal life. But for a child who had lost both parents before he even understood what a family truly was, the word home never again meant a place. It meant people, and people could vanish at any moment. Yet despite all the tragedy, young Leo wasn't some brooding, silent ghost of a boy. Not at all. He was restless, sharp-eyed, mischievous. He loved pranks sometimes too much. He once pushed a visiting lady off the veranda as a joke. She limped for months afterward and later became his future mother-in-law. On another occasion, after being punished and locked in a second-floor room, he simply jumped out the window. Luckily, he landed on soft grass. It would not be the last time he leapt into danger and came out miraculously unharmed. He wasn't an exceptional student. His tutors often complained about his laziness and daydreaming. But he devoured books, asked questions adults weren't prepared to answer, and stared for hours at the horizon as if already searching for meaning in the distance. In those early years, the foundations of Tolstoy's future were quietly being laid. A life shaped by privilege, but haunted by loss. A mind caught between discipline and rebellion. A boy who could never fully trust the world to stay the same, and who would later spend his life trying to understand why people suffer, why they love, why they die, and how they're meant to live. He didn't know it yet, but the seed of the philosopher, the reformer, the restless seeker had already been planted. And soon, life would begin testing him in far more complicated ways. By the time Leo Tolstoy entered his late teens, the polished halls of aristocratic life no longer felt like a legacy, they felt like a burden he couldn't escape. When he moved to Kazan to study at the university, expectations towered over him like stone pillars. Everyone wanted the same thing from him: brilliance, excellence, a future worthy of the Tolstoy name. What they got instead was a young man who felt completely lost. University was supposed to shape him. Instead, it exposed him. Foreign languages were difficult, philosophy was overwhelming, and discipline, something Leo had always struggled with, was nearly impossible. Exams crushed him. Twice he switched faculties, and twice he failed to keep up. Eventually, he dropped out. Not quietly, not boldly, just drifted away, unsure whether the problem lay in the university or inside himself. And so began a period of life that Tolstoy would later remember with both shame and fascination. Moscow and St. Petersburg swallowed him whole. High society embraced him like a prodigal son. There were balls glittering with chandeliers, laughter echoing through smoky parlors, and card tables where fortunes changed hands with the flick of a wrist. Leo didn't simply play, he gambled. Desperately, recklessly, as if the edge of ruin was the only place he truly felt alive. Night after night he sat among officers, aristocrats, and charming strangers, the cards flashing between his fingers, the stakes climbing higher. More than once he lost everything. Once, he gambled away the money he had earned by selling part of his own inheritance, part of the family estate. Years later, he would exaggerate this memory into a legend that he had lost the house, because that's how it felt to him. It wasn't the money that hurt. It was the humiliation. And then came the women, not scandalous, not cruel, but plentiful. Tolstoy was young, restless, constantly falling in love, and just as quickly falling out of it. He filled pages of his diary with self-recriminations, describing himself as lazy, weak-willed, morally corrupted. He wrote lines that sounded like confessions, like battles against an invisible enemy. "I live like a beast," he scribbled. "I despise my life, yet I cannot change it." But anger at himself wasn't enough to stop him. Drinking, dancing, flirting had returned to them again and again. Every morning he promised to begin a new life, every night he failed. And yet, in the middle of this chaos, something important began to take shape. He started keeping a diary, not to boast, but to punish himself, to force honesty into his life. Those early notebooks are raw, almost painful to read. They reveal a young man who is terrified of his own weaknesses yet desperate to rise above them. In those pages, he first began crafting plans for moral perfection, drawing charts, schedules, and rules for how he wanted to live. He always broke them, sometimes within hours. But that effort, the constant struggle between who he was and who he wanted to be, became the central conflict of his youth. And this conflict, more than any lecture or book, would shape the writer he would become. Because behind the gambling tables and glittering ballrooms, behind the shame, indulgence, and daydreams, a fire was slowly building. A desire not just to write stories, but to understand the human soul, starting with his own. And soon, that restless fire would push him far from the safety of aristocratic salons all the way to the wild, dangerous frontier of the Russian Empire. When Leo Tolstoy finally fled the suffocating whirl of Moscow's wine, cards, and late-night promises, he wasn't chasing glory. He was running from debt, from shame, from himself. And he chose the one place that felt far enough from everything: the Caucasus. A land of mountains so sharp they seemed capable of cutting the sky itself. He arrived not as a hero, but as a restless young nobleman seeking refuge among officers stationed on the empire's rugged frontier. And instantly, the world around him changed. Instead of chandeliers and ballroom music, he found crackling campfires, wild horses, cold winds, and the constant scent of danger drifting from the distant gorges. This was a landscape where life and death lived side by side, where every moment felt more real than anything he had ever known. The Caucasus broke through the haze of his wasted youth. Here he learned discipline. Here he tasted fear. Here he first saw humans stripped of all the artificial layers that society piles on them. And here he began writing in earnest, not polished stories for salons, but raw, living sketches of soldiers, horsemen, and the brutal simplicity of war. His early drafts captured something he had never found in himself before: honesty. But the world wasn't done with him yet. In 1854, he traveled to Sevastopol, a city burning under the relentless pressure of the Crimean War. The siege was brutal. Cannon fire never stopped. The smell of gunpowder hung in the air like an unending storm. Soldiers lived in trenches that were little more than graves waiting to be filled. And amidst all this, the young Tolstoy walked through the chaos, fully aware that any step might be his last. There, on the front line, he witnessed humanity at its most fragile and its most magnificent. He watched as officers tried to hide their terror behind stern faces. He watched wounded men joke with unbearable bravery. He watched the dying grip the hands of strangers, desperate for one last human connection. This was war without the glossy illusion of honor. It was suffering. It was courage. It was hell and hope mixed together in the same breath. Tolstoy wrote everything down, not to entertain, but to reveal. His Sevastopol sketches broke through the romantic myth of battle, exposing its blood, fear, and unbearable truth. Readers back in Petersburg were shaken. They had expected heroism, instead they saw humanity. And the young soldier writer, still unsure of who he was, suddenly found his voice. Yet even as his writings gained attention, life refused to soften around him. He narrowly survived more than one bombardment. He watched men he had spoken to minutes earlier fall lifeless in the dirt. The war carved a deep wound inside him, one that would echo across his entire career. He would forever distrust violence, hierarchy, blind patriotism, and the idea that one person had the right to rule another. The Caucasus taught him honesty. Sevastopol taught him tragedy. And together, they forged something entirely new inside him, a vision of the world that would one day challenge empires and leave an unshakable imprint on literature. He had come to the frontier to escape himself. Instead, he found the writer he would become. When Leo Tolstoy returned to Yasnaya Polyana after the chaos of war and the hollow glitter of Petersburg salons, he finally felt the ground under his feet again. The estate had changed: fields rolling into the horizon, old apple orchards, wooden huts of peasants scattered like quiet sentinels. But he had changed. The war had carved into him a new awareness. Life was fragile, unpredictable, and only meaningful when rooted in truth. And so began one of the most unusual chapters of his life: his transformation from celebrated writer to rural schoolmaster. Tolstoy looked at the peasant children around him and saw what he believed Russia lacked the most: freedom. Not political freedom, not lofty philosophical freedom, but the simple freedom to learn, to think, to grow without being crushed by authority. Traditional schools, he believed, weren't teaching, they were enslaving minds. So he opened his own school right on his estate. It was unlike anything Russia had seen. There were no strict schedules, no punishments, no rigid rankings. Children could read, write, sing, run outside, or sit by the stove and listen to stories. They learned through curiosity, not fear. Tolstoy himself sat with them on the floor, barefoot, telling tales from his travels, explaining letters and numbers as if they were magical keys to the world. Some noblemen called him insane. The Ministry of Education called him dangerous. But the children adored him, and their excitement only fueled his belief that true education was not about rules, it was about liberation. Yet while he found clarity in teaching, his personal life was anything but clear. Tolstoy began to feel the first stirrings of deep, unsettling longing. He was past 30, respected, wealthy, but profoundly lonely. And for a man who analyzed every emotion with merciless honesty, loneliness felt like a confession of failure. He started meeting young aristocratic women at balls, dinners, and small gatherings in nearby estates. Some admired him. Some feared him. Some were fascinated by his intense, almost overwhelming personality. Twice he came close to marriage. First, with Valeria Arsenyeva, a bright, graceful young woman who admired his intelligence, but whose family quietly doubted whether Leo's unpredictable nature was safe for their daughter. The relationship dissolved quietly, painfully. Then, with a young princess, Ekaterina Sherbatova. Everything seemed perfect on paper. Noble lineage, beauty, a shared world. For months Leo visited her estate, torn between desire and fear of committing to a life he wasn't sure he could live honestly. In the end, she married another man. Leo didn't attend the wedding. He hid the heartbreak behind a mask of indifference. But in private, he wrote endlessly about moral failure, temptation, and the impossibility of pure love. Out of this emotional chaos emerged one of his early masterpieces, A Family Happiness, a story so intimate that even his closest friends wondered whether he was exposing parts of himself he could never fully heal. By now, the world saw Tolstoy as a writer, a thinker, a reformer. But inside, he was still a man searching for meaning in a life full of contradictions. A nobleman who wanted to live like a peasant, a teacher who rejected authority, a romantic who feared romance itself. He didn't know it yet, but soon he would meet the woman who would forever change the course of his life. A woman who would become his partner, his editor, his inspiration, and the central figure in the most turbulent relationship in Russian literature. If fate ever wanted to play a dramatic trick on Leo Tolstoy, it happened in September of 1862, when a shy 18-year-old girl entered the grand Moscow house of her father, expecting nothing more than a quiet evening. She had no idea that the 34-year-old writer standing across the room, already famous, already legendary, would soon rewrite the entire script of her life. Her name was Sofia Andreevna Bears. Curious eyes, quick mind, gentle voice. She admired Tolstoy long before meeting him, copying passages from his stories into her notebook. To her, he wasn't just a writer, he was a world she dreamed of stepping into. To him, she was a glowing reminder of innocence he feared he had lost forever. Their courtship was shockingly brief. Days, not months. Conversations that felt like lightning bright, sudden, impossible to forget. Tolstoy walked beside her in gardens, talking about life, morality, his failures, his fears. Sophia listened with a seriousness far beyond her age. And for a moment, it seemed destiny was offering him something he had long believed was out of reach. A partner who could love him without judgment. But Leo Tolstoy had a habit of sabotaging his own happiness. On the night before the wedding, he gave Sophia his most private diaries, page after page, describing his past lovers, his scandals, his shame. He wanted honesty. He wanted purity. He wanted her to know everything. Instead, he shattered her heart before their marriage even began. She cried through the night yet married him anyway. Their married life started like a novel, intense, passionate, full of hope. They moved to Yasnaya Polyana, where Sophia immediately became not just a wife, but a collaborator. She copied his manuscripts by candlelight, sometimes rewriting entire drafts multiple times. The early versions of War and Peace passed through her hands more often than through his. She read them, corrected them, organized them. She didn't simply support his genius, she became part of it. And soon, children began filling the house. 1, then 2, then 3, eventually 13. Cradles, laughter, chaos, endless activity. Tolstoy, the restless philosopher, suddenly found himself at the center of an enormous family he never expected to lead. But even in paradise, shadows grew. Tolstoy was still the same man, torn between ideals and impulses, yearning for moral perfection yet unable to escape human weakness. He worked obsessively, often disappearing into his study for hours or days. Sophia juggled the weight of motherhood, household management, and his growing demands. She adored him, depended on him, believed in him. And yet, slowly, painfully, she began losing herself. His affection could be overwhelming one moment and painfully distant the next. His moral rules became stricter, his expectations higher, his frustrations sharper. The same man who wrote about love with unmatched depth could sometimes wound the person who loved him most. Still, Sophia stayed. She read every draft, managed every crisis, endured every mood. She believed in Tolstoy not because he was perfect, but because he was human, brilliant, flawed, and endlessly searching. And despite the cracks beginning to form beneath the surface, their partnership gave birth to something the world had never seen before. For soon, within those same walls of Yasnaya Polyana, Leo Tolstoy would begin writing a book that would change literature forever. When Leo Tolstoy began writing the first pages of War and Peace, he didn't yet know he was creating one of the greatest works in human history. In fact, he didn't even know what the book was. A historical chronicle, a family saga, a philosophical essay, a memoir of his ancestors. At first, it was everything at once, an explosion of ideas he couldn't control. The estate became a battlefield of creativity. Papers covered every table. Pencils snapped. Drafts piled to the ceiling. Sometimes he wrote all night, leaving ink stains on his sleeves. Other days he stormed out of the house, declaring the book a failure, then returned hours later with a new vision that demanded rewriting everything from scratch. Sophia copied every word he produced, sometimes rewriting entire manuscripts 7, 8, even 9 times. She worked by candlelight, her eyes burning, her fingers stiff, while Tolstoy paced the room, dictating new paragraphs with the intensity of a man possessed. Their relationship, already complicated, now revolved around the book like planets around a sun. And slowly, something miraculous took shape. War and Peace became a universe alive, enormous, breathing. Ballrooms glittering with chandeliers. Gunpowder fog crawling through the battlefields. Families laughing, suffering, dreaming. Soldiers marching toward death. Lovers whispering in the shadows. Philosophers arguing with fate. It was not just a novel. It was a living organism, pulsing with every contradiction of life itself. Readers were stunned. Critics didn't know what to do with it. Some called it chaos, others revolutionary. But nobody could deny it. Literature had shifted. A new door had opened, and Tolstoy had stepped through it first. And yet, after finishing this colossal work, Tolstoy fell into a void. He felt drained, empty, unsure of what to create next. For months he drifted, teaching, farming, trying to live simply. But genius rarely rests for long. Soon, a new story began haunting him. A story of a woman trapped between passion and duty. A story that would dissect the soul with the precision of a surgeon. A story that would shake society at its core. Her name was Anna. Writing Anna Karenina was nothing like War and Peace. This time, the conflict wasn't between nations, it was inside the human heart. Tolstoy poured into the novel every doubt he had about love, marriage, temptation, morality, and the fragile balance between desire and destruction. It was darker, sharper, more personal. He wrote the book while struggling with his own life, his marriage growing tense, his beliefs shifting, his soul restless. The novel became a mirror of these inner storms. And when he finally published it, Russia gasped. People discussed the ending in whispers. Some condemned it. Others felt understood for the first time in their lives. But everyone recognized the truth. This was not just a story. It was a confession. Two masterpieces, one a universe of nations, the other an autopsy of the human soul. Both born in the same quiet estate. Both fueled by the same relentless force inside a man who could never stop searching for truth. And just as the world crowned him a literary titan, Tolstoy began to realize that his greatest battles weren't with books or critics, but with his own conscience. By the late 1880s, Leo Tolstoy was no longer simply a novelist. He had become something far more dangerous, a man convinced he had discovered the truth. And truths. After publishing Anna Karenina, Tolstoy plunged into a spiritual crisis. Fame, wealth, admiration, everything the world celebrated had suddenly felt meaningless to him. He stopped going to church, refused confession, abandoned sacraments. Instead, he began writing works like A Confession to Ra, almost shocking attempt to understand why, despite worldwide glory, he often hid ropes and guns so he wouldn't take his own life. In these years, Tolstoy turned into a self-made prophet. He preached nonviolence, denounced the state, rejected private property, and insisted that true Christianity meant living like a simple laborer. His diaries, letters, and pamphlets spread across Russia faster than any novel he had written. Students whispered his ideas in dormitories. Peasants passed his leaflets hand to hand. Reformers admired him. Revolutionaries tried to claim him. The church grew nervous. And then the famine of 1891 struck. 17 provinces faced starvation. Disease spread. Tens of thousands died. While the government hesitated, Tolstoy rode directly into the devastated villages, opening soup kitchens, raising money, feeding the hungry with his own hands. He became the conscience of the nation. And then he committed the act that nearly destroyed his marriage. He renounced all copyrights to his works written before 1881 as the books that brought his family stability and wealth. To him it was the ultimate step toward moral purity. To his wife, Sofia Andreevna, it was betrayal. But the real earthquake arrived in the form of one man, Vladimir Chertkov. Tall, wealthy, fanatically devoted to Tolstoy's new philosophy, Chertkov quickly became the writer's closest disciple. He admired Tolstoy with almost religious devotion. He controlled publications, edited manuscripts, and whispered to Tolstoy about renunciation, simplicity, and selfless sacrifice. Sofia hated him instantly. To her, Chertkov was a manipulator, a man pushing her husband toward madness, poverty, and the destruction of their children's future. Their home, once noisy with babies and manuscripts, turned into a battlefield. Tolstoy, now in his 60s, repeatedly threatened to leave. Sofia searched his pockets at night, terrified he would run away. The great writer began hiding his diary in the leg of his boot so she wouldn't find it. The conflict grew unbearable. Letters, tears, accusations, scenes. Tolstoy tried to escape the house more than once, walking out with only a bag, only to return hours later. But with every year, Chertkov's shadow grew. And with every year, Sofia's desperation deepened. The house in Yasnaya Polyana, once the birthplace of war and peace, was now a powder keg. And all Russia watched as the greatest writer of the century, the moral voice of millions, slowly lost the one treasure he could never renounce: his own family. By the start of the 20th century, Leo Tolstoy stood at the center of a world unraveling. Empires trembled, revolutions simmered, and the old order cracked under its own weight. And Tolstoy, a barefoot sage, global celebrity, moral agitator, found himself pulled into the chaos whether he wanted it or not. His relationship with the authorities had always been tense, but now it became openly hostile. The government watched him as a dangerous influence. The church had already declared him outside its fold. And then came the letters, a sharp, merciless, unforgettable. One of the most famous was addressed to Prime Minister Pyotr Stolypin. Tolstoy accused the government of cruelty, injustice, and blind repression. He begged Stolypin to end the executions, to see people as human beings rather than threats. Stolypin replied calmly, firmly, "Property must be protected, order must be preserved." Tolstoy wrote a furious draft calling the minister the most pitiable man in Russia. A letter so harsh he never dared to send it. Meanwhile, another force entered Tolstoy's life, a rising writer named Maxim Gorky. Their first meeting was electric. Tolstoy admired Gorky's raw power. Gorky looked at Tolstoy as if meeting a living myth. But history wasn't finished with them. When Gorky was arrested for revolutionary propaganda, Tolstoy fought for his release. When the 1905 revolution exploded, blood on the snow, workers shot at the Winter Palace, Tolstoy condemned both sides. The Tsarist regime, he said, was doomed. Violence, he warned, could not bring freedom. Revolutionaries called him naive. Officials called him dangerous. Gorky, once an admirer, grew distant. The two giants drifted apart like ships in a storm. Yet Tolstoy remained at the center of global attention. His essays on freedom, conscience, and nonviolence spread across continents. Philosophers, activists, and radicals read him hungrily. Among them was a young Indian lawyer in South Africa, Mohandas K. Gandhi. Gandhi saw in Tolstoy the blueprint for a new form of resistance: nonviolent struggle. The two men exchanged letters, their ideas sparking across oceans. Tolstoy's final message to Gandhi would become a cornerstone of modern civil disobedience. And still, at home, Tolstoy wrestled with darker questions. Death fascinated him, not with fear, but with an almost scientific curiosity. He watched the dying, spoke of the transition to the eternal, resisted medicine even when ill himself. His family found this obsession terrifying. Tolstoy found it natural. Russia was changing around him. Revolution brewed everywhere, in factories, in villages, in universities. Tolstoy saw the inevitable collapse of the old world, yet refused to join the new one. He belonged to neither side. He was a nation unto himself. But the pressure kept rising of public adoration from the world, worship from his followers, fury from the authorities, and unbearable tension inside his own home. All of it was pushing him toward the final break. A break that would come in the dead of night, with a packed suitcase, a hidden diary, and an old man slipping silently through the garden, running from everything he had built. It happened quietly, almost invisibly at the moment when the greatest writer of his age decided he could no longer bear the weight of his own life. October 1910. Yasnaya Polyana slept under a cold sky while Tolstoy, 82 years old, moved silently through the house. His wife Sophia, terrified he might run away, slept with open doors and listened for every rustle. His diary, the one he now hid in the leg of his boot, trembled with restless thoughts. At midnight he heard Sophia searching through his things again, and something inside him snapped. He sat at his desk, trembling, and wrote a farewell letter, tender, sorrowful, final. Then he packed. Not much. A coat, a change of linen, papers, a little food. Pure necessity for a man fleeing his own fame. He stepped into the darkness, but the familiar garden suddenly felt like a maze. He stumbled, hit branches, fell into the wet grass. For a moment he thought he was lost in an endless forest, though he had not even left his estate. Still, he pressed on. By dawn, Tolstoy boarded a train, refusing any privilege. He wouldn't take a private carriage. He wanted to travel with the people, coughing in the thick smoke of the third class. He went first to Optina Monastery, but fear or doubt kept him from entering. Then to his sister Maria at the Sciamordino convent, where the two old souls spoke softly of life, death, and God. But rest never came. The tension at home, the eyes of the world, the weight of his followers, everything pushed him onward. He fled again, intending to reach southern ports, perhaps even leave Russia forever. Instead, he caught a chill. At the tiny station of Astapovo, Tolstoy collapsed. The station master offered his own house. Doctors arrived. Reporters crowded outside. Telegraphed rumors flew across continents. Tolstoy has vanished. Tolstoy found gravely ill. The whole world held its breath. Sophia arrived at last, sobbing, begging to be let inside. But Chertkov and the doctors kept her away for days, fearing another family scene. Only at the very end was she allowed to approach quietly, trembling, stepping into a dim room where her husband no longer recognized her. At dawn on November 7, October 28, old style, Leo Tolstoy whispered fragmented words of truth. I love how they've been slipped away. No icons. No ceremony. Just a quiet end to a titanic life. He was buried in the woods at Yasnaya Polyana, on the spot he had loved as a boy, the place where the green stick with the secret of happiness was buried. He once said, Russia mourned like never before. Factories stopped. Students marched. Farmers cried. Newspapers from New York to Tokyo printed front-page tributes. The world understood. A pillar of human thought had fallen. But his family fractured. His followers argued. His manuscripts traveled the globe. And his ideas about peace, faith, violence, justice, and love kept spreading long after the grave closed over him. A man who tried to escape everything of fame, wealth, authority, even his own home became, despite himself, immortal. If you enjoyed this story and want more deep, cinematic histories like this one, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon. Your support helps us bring more incredible stories to life.